The United States, it seems, is, with surprising rapidity, losing its position in the world, losing its dominant position in the world. And it's now being seen as just a part of a multipolar global environment with many other emerging powers and superpowers. And in some quarters, mainly traditional societies in the world, the United States is even being seen as a bad guy, as an evil empire of a sorts. Now, when I think back on this, it all is such a eerie reversal because Reagan called the Soviet Union an evil empire. The only people who would call the United States an evil empire were Islamic radicals. If I flash back now to about 2000, 2001, bin Laden gave a kind of an infamous address in which he talked about the United States as, quote, the head of the snake. And part of his argument is that there were many evil powers in the world, some of the Gulf kingdoms, Israel, but the head of the snake, the worst, the people, the power spreading its influence to all the others was, in fact, the United States. And when you see the Biden administration relentlessly promoting these LGBTQ agendas, I just saw on television Anthony Blinken, the Secretary of State, he goes, LGBTQ now is our foreign policy. Think about that. Think about going to people around the world, traditional people in Asia, in Africa, some in South America, certainly in the Middle East, and trying to force them to change their laws and fly LGBTQ flags and tie U.S. Trade deals and U.S. technology agreements and also U.S. aid, all to embracing this agenda that many of them find morally abhorrent. I mean, this is a problem. And it goes beyond the social agenda. Here you have the United States, which it now seems has been the key player, in fact, may be the initiator of blowing up the Nord Stream 2 pipeline. And after some reporting on this and some admissions by deep state officials in the United States, well, yes, this was done by Ukrainian saboteurs. But then people said, wait a minute, Ukrainian saboteurs can't do this on their own. They're not going to be able to pull off this kind of operation in a highly guarded area. It seems to involve the cooperation of the Norwegians and the Finns. So you get these Scandinavian governments participating. That has to be something organized by the United States. And recently in the New York Times, very interesting, a long article about the Nord Stream pipeline that concludes, in effect, it may be in no one's interest to find out more about who did this. This is almost like something the New York Times reporter got from some CIA official. Hey, listen, put out the idea that nobody really wants to find out. Well, who's going to say that? Who's the kind of person who says nobody wants to find out? Usually it's the perpetrator. Usually it's the people who did it. They're like, yeah, it's not really that important to know who did it. Let's just acknowledge that it happened and kind of move on. So think about, again, how the world is going to react when you have the United States and condemning international terrorism, going after people and saying, listen, you're a terrorist, this is a terrorist organization, you're on the State Department's list of terrorist organizations. And here's the United States covertly. It'd be one thing if the United States said, listen, we are at war with Russia. We are openly taking the side of Ukraine. Yes, of course, we're going to blow up the Nord Stream pipeline. That's the way in which the Russians, but that's too provocative. The Russians might then decide they're going to start blowing up American targets. They might decide, let's escalate, move closer into the nuclear arena. So you don't want to do that. So you do this covertly. You act like, we don't know who did it. Oh, it's probably some renegade Ukrainians, kind of like in the movies. It's never really the communists who do it. It's just some renegade who wants to set up his own evil empire. And he's the guy that's doing it that James Bond has to then track down. Now, here are two signs of the new order, the new world order, if I can put it that way, to use a known phrase that seems to be emerging. India, I read this in the Indian press, India is now selling 200,000 barrels of oil a day to the EU. And when I saw that, I was like, India is selling barrels. India doesn't have any oil. India has very little oil. So how is India able to sell 200,000 barrels a day to the EU? Well, here's the answer. The Indians buy the oil from the Russians. They mark it up to make a kind of middleman's profit, and then they sell it right back to the EU. So the point is that the EU says, oh yeah, we're joining the United States. We have all these sanctions. We stand in solidarity with Ukraine. We're not buying oil from Russia. Okay, the Russians sell it to the Indians turn around and sell it to the EU. So Russian oil ends up in the EU, and the Indians are quite happy to make a kind of middleman's commission on the deal. The French president, Emmanuel Macron, just got back from, guess where? China. And here is what he comes back saying, quote, "The great risk Europe faces is, quote, getting caught up in crises that are not ours." He goes on to say, hey, listen, everyone keeps dragging us into Ukraine and they keep dragging us into Taiwan. They want us to issue an ultimatum that if China does something with Taiwan, we're going to be there fighting on the Taiwanese side. He goes, listen, that's not necessarily our fight. I'm spelling out a little bit more what Macron is getting at, but what he's basically saying is if America wants to do these things, it doesn't mean that Europe has to go along. He goes, in effect, the question Europeans need to answer, is it in our interest to accelerate a crisis on Taiwan? No. The worst thing would be to think we Europeans must become followers on this topic and take our cue from the US agenda and a Chinese overreaction. He also goes on to say that it might be in Europe's interest to have China as a regional superpower. In other words, what he's saying is, why does Europe want a unipolar world with the United States telling everybody else what to do? I think the point I'm making here is not just that there is this resistance that's building up, including the key point here, and the reason I'm focusing on Europe, is this is supposed to be our allies. This is how our allies are talking now. And I think what this means is that the United States has, through the Biden regime, squandered our claim to leadership, is disgracing ourselves in front of the world. Even I mentioned a few days ago last week, the president of puny El Salvador. He's like, wait a minute, if the United States is going to arrest the leader of the opposition party, how can you arrest other countries when they do the same thing? Whatever you think about Trump, whatever you think about the merits of the case, if El Salvador did that or some other country did that, the United States immediately becomes very huffy, draws itself up to full height. No, this kind of behavior is not characteristic of a free society. Well, wait a minute. A lot of things going on in the United States today don't seem to be characteristic of a free society either.